A few years ago, right, a comedian told this kind of vague, passing anecdote on a show, just about some guy hitting on her, asking her to walk him to his truck.
Right, just a totally throwaway joke.
Exactly, just a throwaway. But within weeks, that single, seemingly harmless little anecdote resulted in, like, 300-page legal dossiers, the deployment of what they called monster lawyers, and the complete just algorithmic destruction of a massive comedy empire. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's crazy how fast that escalated.
Oh, completely wild. You know, when you think about stand-up comedy, you probably picture a pretty simple transaction, right? One person, a brick wall, a microphone. You laugh, they get paid. It feels like this ultimate pure meritocracy.
It is, it's a beautifully crafted illusion, honestly. We're totally sold this idea of the lone philosopher on a stage, this purely solitary art form where the only thing that matters is the quality of the punchline.
Right.
But if you pull back the curtain just a few inches, that brick wall looks a lot more like a stage set for like a geopolitical thriller.
Yeah, the backstage landscape of modern comedy is insanely cutthroat right now. So we're going to map out this hidden civil war for you today. We've spent hours poring over this massive web of sources, multi-part video exposés, tense podcast showdowns, overlapping digital feuds.
There's so much material out there.
There really is. And our mission today is to sift through all of it to understand how the power dynamics of stand-up have just completely mutated. We're diving into the territorial wars, the podcast empires, and the very real consequences of crossing the wrong digital army.
Because the reality of the industry today, and this is key, the most lucrative entertainment product isn't the tight 5-minute set you see on stage anymore.
No, not at all.
The product is the meta-narrative. The backstage power struggles are generating like way more views, more engagement, and just more money than the actual jokes.
Okay, let's unpack this. And there is absolutely no better place to start than the current epicenter of the comedy universe, Austin, Texas.
Right, the new Mecca.
Exactly. Specifically, Joe Rogan's highly hyped club, the Comedy Mothership. I mean, if you've listened to any comedian show over the last 2 years, you have heard about this place.
Oh, relentlessly.
Yeah, it's been promoted as the new promised land, like the modern equivalent of the legendary Comedy Store in Los Angeles. But beneath all that utopian hype, some serious fractures are starting to show.
Yeah, the narrative of this comedy paradise is kind of actively crumbling from within. We're seeing this growing underbelly of intense dissatisfaction, and, well, it's playing out very publicly.
It really is. Take the mysterious bans, for example. Comedians are quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, just getting barred from the club. Like Tyler Fisher, he's spoken out about being banned.
Right.
And Leonardo Joni, she went on the Slumber Party podcast to detail how she found out she was banned, and this whole bizarre process of trying to piece together, like, why it even happened.
It's all very opaque.
It's super opaque. But the absolute loudest criticism is coming from someone who is deeply entrenched in this system, comedian Ty Rivera. He was a paid regular at the Mothership until very recently, and he just dropped this intense, multi-part video expose.
And Rivera's breakdown of the club's inner workings is meticulously specific.
Oh, he names names.
He really does. He doesn't just complain about a bad night. He systematically argues that the hype and the financial promises of the club are essentially a massive lie.
But the weird thing is, he doesn't point the finger at Joe Rogan.
No, he doesn't.
Instead, he totally unloads on the club's booker, Adam Egget. Rivera calls Egget completely incompetent, claims he's clouded by blatant favoritism, and flat out labels him the biggest problem at the venue.
Yeah, he paints a picture of a great club being basically ruined by its middle management.
Right. And I have to wonder, though, if this is Rogan's club, like his kingdom, why is the booker getting all the heat? I mean, it feels a bit like someone getting a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, but then running to the tabloids to complain about the shift manager of the gobstopper room,
That's a great analogy. What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanics of how comedy power structures actually function. When you establish a new mecca like the Mothership.
A room that has been hyped to the moon.
Exactly. Hyped to the point where every comedian in America feels they absolutely must perform there to stay relevant. When you do that, you engineer a massive structural bottleneck. A demand for stage time is always going to mathematically dwarf the supply.
There's thousands of comics trying to squeeze through a single door.
And Adam Egget is the guy holding the keys to that door. In this new ecosystem, a booker isn't just, someone filling out a spreadsheet for the weekend lineup.
No, they're the ultimate gatekeeper.
Precisely. They hold the keys to a comedian's livelihood, their industry prestige, and their digital visibility.
Which is everything now.
Right. So imagine a comedian moves their entire life to Austin based on all these utopian promises they heard on a podcast.
Right.
And then they get there and they can't get stage time. The psychological fallout of that is immense.
Oh, I bet.
The booker becomes the physical embodiment of their rejection. So Rivera attacking Ija, it's really a manifestation of a systemic scarcity problem, but it's disguised as an interpersonal conflict.
That makes a ton of sense. That bottleneck breeds resentment, and that resentment doesn't just stay confined to the green room anymore. It's spilling over into a much broader public rebellion against the entire ecosystem surrounding the club, what people are calling the Rogan sphere.
Right, the tight-knit inner circle of comedians and podcasters orbiting Joe Rogan.
Exactly. The tension over stage time and club politics in Austin has become the catalyst for a full-blown digital turf war. You have prominent veteran comics who are starting to actively criticize Rogan's stranglehold on the industry.
Mark Maron and Stavros Halkias, for instance.
Yeah, they've been very vocal about the fatigue surrounding the Austin comedy scene. But the spark that really set this whole thing off happened when Steph Tillev went on Andrew Santino's podcast, Whiskey Ginger.
Right. She used her appearance on that platform to openly share her negative experiences dealing with the mothership.
She totally pierced the veil of the utopian narrative.
And the blowback to that was immediate.
Oh, swift and brutal. Joe Rogan fired back at Mark Maron for trashing him and his circle of friends. But the most revealing part of this whole saga, to me at least, is when comedian Andrew Schulz steps into the fray.
Yeah, Schulz basically appoints himself as the enforcer for the Rogan sphere.
Exactly. He directs his fire not just at the critics, but at the platforms hosting them. He specifically calls out Andrew Santino. His issue wasn't just that Tillev and Maron were complaining. His issue was that Santino platformed them and didn't push back against their criticisms of Austin.
Right.
And Schulz also takes direct aim at Stavros Halkias, accusing him of changing and straying from his roots. But hold on, why is Schulz attacking Santino just for listening?
It's an interesting dynamic.
I mean, Santino wasn't the one making the complaint. You don't see Jimmy Fallon getting attacked by movie studios because a guest complained about a director on his couch. This sounds less like a comedy scene and more like a mafia family demanding absolute loyalty.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really reveals how podcasting has fundamentally rewritten the rules of comedy alliances.
Okay, how so?
Well, in the olden days, comedians might talk trash in the back of a dingy club, and the conflict just stayed within those four walls.
Right.
Today, a podcast with millions of downloads functions exactly like a broadcast network. In this audio medium, platforming a critic without aggressively shutting them down is viewed as an implicit endorsement of their critique.
Oh, I see. Because in a conversational podcast, silence equals agreement.
Precisely. In the modern comedy ecosystem, your podcast network operates like a geopolitical alliance. It's your NATO.
Your NATO, that's so true.
You share audiences, you do guest spots on each other's shows to pump up your specials algorithm, you cross-pollinate your Patreon subscribers. It's a deeply intertwined shared economy.
So when Santino sits there and lets a guest critique the central pillar of that economy, which is Rogan and the Austin scene failing to defend the boss, is treated as an act of treason against the alliance.
Exactly. Andrew Schulz acting as the enforcer is really just him patrolling the borders of their economic territory.
The podcast is the territory. And treating a podcast like sovereign territory is exactly what leads us to the most explosive, reality-shattering feud in recent history.
Oh, absolutely.
If you want proof that digital beefs have massive, catastrophic, real-world consequences, look no further than the Brendan Schaub versus Bobby Lee and Kalela Kuhn saga.
This is the textbook case study of the new power dynamics. It perfectly illustrates what happens when traditional intimidation tactics collide with a mobilized digital army.
And it all started with that throwaway joke I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive. The infamous truck walk, or trugwog, as the internet relentlessly dubbed it.
Right.
Comedian Annie Letterman was on the Trash Tuesday podcast with Kalela Kuhn. They were casually, somewhat vaguely, discussing a married comedian who had hit on them, asking them to walk into his truck.
And they didn't even name names.
They didn't. But the internet is undefeated, and within days, Reddit detectives had pieced together the timeline and figured out it was Brendan Schaub.
Schaub being a former UFC fighter turned comedian and podcaster and, a very prominent, highly visible member of that exact same Rogan sphere we were just discussing.
Right. Now, in a normal world, Schaub might have ignored it Or maybe made a self-deprecating joke on his own show to diffuse the tension.
Yeah, just laugh it off.
Instead, he goes absolutely nuclear. He allegedly threatens the team behind the Tiger Belly podcast, which is hosted by Bobby Lee and Kalila Kuhn. He claims he has retained monster lawyers and possesses 300 pages of evidence compiled from Reddit.
Which is just wild.
Schaub's theory was that Bobby Lee was the secret mastermind behind an organized, coordinated online hate campaign designed to ruin his career.
He essentially attempted to use the heavy-handed traditional tools of corporate intimidation, lawyers, legal threats, dossiers, to silence a sprawling digital rumor mill.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. This entire situation culminates in this legendary, excruciatingly tense confrontation on Tiger Belly, episode 347.
I remember that episode.
Schaub actually sits down in their studio, and Bobby and Kalila air every single dirty detail out right to his face, on mic, with the cameras rolling.
They held nothing back.
They break down the exact timeline of the legal threats, they demand to see these mythical 300 pages of evidence, and they essentially dismantle his conspiracy theory in real time. It is incredibly uncomfortable watch, but you physically cannot look away.
It's gripping.
It really is.
Yeah.
How did a passing joke about walking to a truck escalate into a high-stakes legal showdown capable of ending a career?
It escalated because Brendan Schaub fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield he was stepping onto.
Okay, this saga represents the total weaponization of the podcast audience. You have to understand, traditional celebrity feuds play out in the glossy pages of magazines or through carefully crafted PR statements.
Right, very controlled.
But podcasts cultivate a parasocial army.
Parasocial meaning the listener develops a one-sided but intensely deeply felt psychological bond with the host. You listen to a show for hundreds of hours, and your brain genuinely processes those hosts as your close personal friends.
That's the key. You feel fiercely protective of them.
So when Schaub threatened Bobby Lee with monster lawyers and federal investigations, he didn't just threaten a fellow stand-up comic. He threatened a massive, hyper-loyal, digitally native fan base. And that fan base mobilized with frightening efficiency.
They went to war for their guys.
They systematically dismantled Schaub's digital footprint. When Schaub released his comedy special, Gringo Poppy, the Reddit army, coordinated a massive downvoting campaign.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, manipulating the IMDb algorithms until it was labeled the worst comedy special of all time.
Brutal.
They generated an endless stream of content mocking him, analyzing his every word, and hijacking the search algorithms associated with his name.
So he tried to fight the internet and lost.
Basically. Schaub tried to fight a modern digital insurgency using outdated corporate tactics, but in the podcast era, authenticity and audience loyalty are the only currencies that matter.
And Tiger Belly weaponized their transparency.
Exactly. By broadcasting the confrontation on that episode, they let their audience see behind the curtain. Schaub's career empire didn't crumble because of the initial joke. It crumbled because his legal threats united an entire internet army against him.
The UFC distanced itself, his television projects suffered, and his reputation just took a fatal blow. It is wild to realize that the audience is now the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner.
They really are.
But this idea of intensely loyal, mobilized tribes doesn't just apply to these digital podcast beefs. It's actually bleeding out of the internet and reshaping physical geography. We are seeing beefs that predate the podcast era being amplified by these digital armies.
Right, the systemic geographical rivalries are becoming just as potent as the interpersonal ones.
The most glaring example is this ongoing, bitter, systemic beef between New York City comics and Los Angeles comics.
Classic East Coast, West Coast.
Exactly. Right now, there is a massive amount of chatter about New York comedians struggling to get stage time at the world-famous Comedy Store in L.A.
Yeah.
They feel like they are being intentionally frozen out by the West Coast establishment.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension there.
And in response, you see the rise of fiercely NYC-centric podcast alliances like The Regs. That's a show featuring Bobby Kelly, Joe List, Dan Soder, and Louis J. Gomez, and they're basically planting a flag in the ground for East Coast gritty comedy.
Although at the same time, we do see these fascinating attempts at, cross-border diplomacy.
Yeah. Louis J. Gomez actually flew down to Austin to go on the Joe Rogan Experience, crossing enemy lines, essentially specifically to squash the beef between the New York podcasters and the Rogan sphere.
Yeah.
But while these new geopolitical beefs are being negotiated, the violent, messy legacy beefs of the past are being dug up and immortalized as podcast lore.
It's all content now.
Yeah, you can listen to Shane Gillis and Matt McCusker dissecting an old physical scuffle between Michael Rappaport and Ari Shaffir. Or you hear endless retellings of the infamous historical incident where Ari Shaffir physically beat up Bobby Lee outside a club years ago.
It highlights a really profound transition in how conflict is processed and monetized in this industry.
But I have to ask you, and I really want you to think about this as you're listening, is this just the stand-up comedy version of the 90s East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry? Like, why does the zip code or the physical building you tell jokes in even matter when everyone is broadcasting to the exact same global internet?
It's a fair question.
I mean, Dan Soder sitting in a studio in New York and Andrew Santino sitting in a studio in LA are both reaching the exact same kid watching YouTube on his phone in Ohio. Why are they fighting over access to the Comedy Store or the mothership?
This raises an important point about the nature of prestige in a digital, borderless age. You're entirely right that the internet has flattened distribution. And financially speaking, the podcasts are what pay the mortgages.
Right.
But within the psychology of the comedians themselves, the physical stage still holds a mythical, almost religious status. The Comedy Store in LA or the Mothership in Austin aren't just rooms with a microphone.
They're institutions.
They are the institutions that confer legitimacy.
It's the stark difference between being internet famous and being respected by your peers.
Exactly. And the NYC versus LA beef is fundamentally a proxy war over which style of comedy gets to dictate the cultural taste of the country.
Oh, that makes sense.
New York comedy prides itself on being hyperverbal, fast-paced, and traditional skills honed in tiny, unforgiving, low-ceiling basements where you have to dominate the room to survive.
Yeah.
LA comedy has historically been viewed by New Yorkers as more polished, industry-driven, and focused on being a stepping stone to landing a sitcom deal.
Right.
So when New York comics complain about getting iced out of the Comedy Store, they aren't just complaining about losing 15 minutes of stage time. They are fighting against the LA aesthetic dominating the national conversation.
And the way they fight has changed too, right?
Yeah.
Like looking back at those physical altercations like Ari Shaffir and Bobby Lee.
That perfectly illustrates the evolution. 15 years ago, a comedy beef might literally end in a bloody physical fight in the parking lot of a club, because that club was the only arena that existed.
It was a closed circuit.
Exactly. Today, actual physical violence is incredibly rare. But digital violence, the algorithmic destruction we saw happen to Brendan Schaub, that is common.
Very common.
The physical fights of the past are just mined for content now. They are turned into engaging lore to feed the podcast machine, while the actual modern warfare is fought over platform access, algorithmic dominance, and weaponizing audience loyalty.
Wow. We have really covered a massive amount of ground today. We started at the door of the comedy mothership, looking at how booking bottlenecks and Adam Egget created a powder keg of resentment.
Right.
We followed that resentment as it spilled over into the intense loyalty tests and podcast enforcers of the Rogan sphere.
The whole mafia dynamic.
Yeah, and then we broke down how a single passing joke escalated into 300-page legal threats and the total audience weaponization of the Tiger Belly and Schaub saga.
Such a crazy story.
And finally, we zoomed out to see the bi-coastal turf wars fighting for the very soul of the art form.
It is a breathtakingly complex ecosystem that has completely rewritten its own rules of survival in less than a decade.
So what does this all mean? When you take a step back from the individual dramas, the bands, and the bruised egos, what is the core takeaway for anyone watching this industry evolve?
It means we have to fundamentally update our definition of the art form.
Okay.
Stand-up comedy used to be exclusively about the craftsmanship of a tight 5-minute set. You worked in obscurity for years to get 5 minutes on late-night television, and that set was the sole product you offered the world.
Right, that was the goal.
Today, the real entertainment product is the cinematic universe of the comedian. The podcast alliances, the backstage politics, the feuds, the vulnerability, the lore, that meta-narrative is what the audience is actually buying into. The jokes on stage are now just a companion piece to the drama happening off stage.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to ponder. If the conversational podcast, the 300-page dossier, the digital drama, and the territorial beefs are consistently generating millions more views and vastly more intense engagement than the actual meticulously crafted stand-up specials, are we reaching a point where the comedy itself is just a side hustle? Have these comedians accidentally invented the world's most popular, decentralized reality television show where that lonely brick wall and the microphone are really just a stage set in illusion for the real drama happening behind the scenes? It's something to think about next time you hit play.